Hi, friends. So, Ty here had started a discussion. It's not a bad discussion. Of course, he got some crap thrown at him. But for the most part, the vibe was decent. It's kind of what you would expect on Threads. And the initial comment was the rainbow is God's covenant. The rainbow does not represent LGBTQ. Well, I'm not going to put up with any sort of homophobia, transphobia crap like that. And I said, the rainbow represents God's covenant for all people. God's love for all people, not just everyone who you thinks it should be for. And that's generally my spiel when my teenager or I are in more conservative circles and sporting our rainbows. Because it's a really great way of sort of confronting them on their hypocrisy and their judgmental attitude. Well, Ty asked the question, so why did God send the flood? And if we want to look at strictly what the Bible says, God sent the flood because people were bad. However, while I take the Bible seriously, I have a ministerial background. It's what I do. It's appropriate. I do not take it literally. Now, why do we have this record of a flood in the Bible? What happened? Well, Genesis 6 tells us that the Lord looked on the earth and people were really, really bad and wicked. And he tells Noah, hey, I'm going to flood the earth. I want you to build an ark. What causes the flood? Well, the Bible tells us that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And if you do the math and how much time it took for the waters to recede and so forth, they were in the ark for about 10 months. So why do I not believe that the flood account, as it's in the Bible, is real? Well, there's a lot. One, we have to remember that Genesis was written as a record of very primitive people trying to explain the world around them. They were trying to answer the basic questions of humanity. Where did we come from? How did we get here? Why are things the way they are? Realistically, even though the Bible says there was rain and so forth and so on, the likely answer is that there was maybe heavier snowfall in the mountains of what's today Syria, which is where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers have their origins, which means when the snow melted in the spring, the rivers would have been higher, which could cause flood. Also, maybe at the same time, you had a wetter than usual spring. So in addition to the heavier melt coming down from the mountains, you also had rain on top of that, causing the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley to flood. Now, there are records of a flood during this time. Ancient Sumerian records show that there was a flood over this region around the same time as the estimated time of the Noah's Ark story. It was also not terribly unusual. It wasn't very common for the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley to flood, but, it did happen occasionally. It wasn't totally unheard of. The writers, the ancient the ancient Israelites, this is their whole world. All they know of the world is what today is referred to as Mesopotamia, or the Fertile Crescent, what's today Iraq. That was their whole world as they knew it. So to see a huge flood meant that, they saw what they saw, and that was it. They don't have a conception of an idea of this piece of land way over here, this piece of land, this area of land over here. But let's look at the Bible, because when I look at Bible passages, I am really, really in depth. I look at, where does this passage fall in the greater text? Do I see things that repeat? I pull apart from the original language as best as I can and put it back together, because sometimes idioms in Hebrew or Greek, if I'm in the New Testament, get lost in translation. When looking at Genesis, scholars tend to believe that there are two sources for the material in Genesis. You have the Elohist source. You see that, for example, in Genesis 1, God created. It's all God, not the Lord. And the Elohist source is an older source. And then you also have the Yahwist source. So everywhere you see the Lord is the Yahwist source. Most scholars date that material to after the exile. And the exile of Judah was 587 BCE, and they were in exile until later in that century, so the low 500s BCE. So much later, a much longer rear view for Yahwist source materials. Now, but who would be this Yahweh in Genesis? If you look at the Bible as a chronological record, God does not reveal God's name as Yahweh until you get to Exodus 3, which is about 700 or so years after Noah, at least 700. Okay, because you have to account for all the generations from Noah to Abraham, and then you have 3 generations of Abraham mentioned in Genesis, all the way down to Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons, and then 400 years of slavery in Egypt. So hundreds upon hundreds of years between Noah and the Exodus. Hundreds and hundreds of years between the time of Noah and God revealing God's name as Yahweh to Moses in Exodus 3. God tells Noah in chapter 6, take 2 of every kind of animal on the ark, male and female. But then in the early chapter 7, God says, take 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals. Well, again, this idea of clean and unclean animals doesn't even come around until after the Exodus, while the Israelites are wandering in the desert, and God gives Moses the complete law, the Torah. So, how would a writer prior to this time have any sort of idea about Yahweh? Because in the Hebrew, the word for God there is Yahweh. And how would they know which animals are clean and which animals are unclean? Okay, even from the most basic scientific mathematical framework, the math doesn't math. The ark was a little longer than a soccer pitch and about 3/4 as wide. Okay, just wasn't very big. And think about if you have every different kind of animal, like can penguins coexist with cheetahs? Or how about polar bears and ostriches? Animals that come from such very vast different climates and living environments could not coexist together on this ark. And we won't even go into, all the food, predator and prey and all that other stuff. The other part of this Noah Ark explanation, was this like multicolored thing in the sky? Well, we're going to call it a rainbow. Well, why do we have a rainbow? Because of this. It happened to show up after this time of rain. This was also a really handy way for the Israelites to conceive of an idea of why the Canaanites are their enemies. In Genesis, I want to say 10, Noah and his wife and his sons have settled. They have come off the ark. All the animals are free. God's made this covenant. And Noah settles down to be a farmer, and he has vineyards and makes wine. Well, the scriptures tell us that one particular day he had been tasting a little bit too much of his wine and was drunk and fell asleep naked. Ham goes in, sees his dad naked, doesn't do anything, goes out, tells his brothers, Japhet and Shem. Japhet and Shem take a cloak, put it over their shoulders, walk backwards into Noah's tent, and throw the cloak over him to cover his nakedness. Now, we don't know what Ham's thing was. We don't know why he didn't do anything to cover his dad. We don't know if he was laughing about it to his brothers or if he was like, y'all, I just saw Dad naked and I'm not sure what to do. Well, when Noah wakes up and finds out what Ham did, he curses Ham's descendants. And the first one of these that's mentioned is Canaan, the ancestor to who would become the Canaanites. And so this story, this framing of the story would have given these Israelites a reason. Why do we hate the Canaanites so much? Well, we need to make up a story. Okay, so God sent us into this promised land that he gave to Abraham, but there were Canaanites there. And why do we hate them? Why do we have to drive them out? Why do we have to kill them? Why do we have to take loot from them? Well, we're going to have a story about that. And they made a story about that. They made a story about Noah cursing Ham's son, Canaan. In passage, Noah says, your son will be slave to his brothers. And that sadly gave justification to Europeans who were trading in African people and enslaving African people. They used that, they called them sons of Ham, as biblical justification for the heinousness of African enslavement. But that's not the point of this one. So there's my hot take on the flood account. And, other mythologies, other ancient civilizations also had flood accounts. China had a flood account. As I've already mentioned, the Sumerians had a flood account. The Maya had a flood account. So it wasn't even just in Asia or just in Southwest Asia. It was in what's today Mesoamerica. So, peace.